Hello. Welcome. Jesus warned, "They come to you in sheep's clothing," he said, "but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. The disguise is soft, their appearance is common, the words sound right, yet their heart is destructive. By their fruit you will recognize them, not by the clothing they wear or the claims they make, but by what their lives actually produce when the season of testing arrives. Not everyone who says, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of the Father. Many will stand and declare that they prophesied in his name, drove out demons, and performed miracles. The list of accomplishments will sound impressive. The activity will look powerful. Yet he will answer with words that leave no room for negotiation. 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.' The outside can look harmless, while the inside remains unchanged. Fruit reveals the truth that clothing conceals. Miracles are not the final proof. Words of devotion are not the final proof. What a life produces when no one is watching, when the pressure is real, when the choice costs something. That is the test Jesus places in the hands of those who listen. The warning is not meant to leave the heart restless. It is meant to settle it. The fruit does not lie. The tree is known by what it bears, and every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Jesus had just set the narrow gate before them, the small entrance deliberately chosen, leading toward the life that genuine faith opens. 2 roads stretched ahead. 2 destinations waited at their ends. The invitation was urgent. Look carefully at the path your feet are already walking. Then, before the teaching closed, he spoke the warning the narrow gate made necessary. There would be people standing near that entrance who were not there to help anyone find it. Watch out for false prophets. The words carried no casual tone. They were not a simple reminder that false prophets exist somewhere in the world. They were a call to stay awake, to keep the kind of steady attention that does not ease simply because danger is not always easy to see at first glance. The danger Jesus named was shaped to slip past the ordinary ways people protect themselves. It was made to look gentle. It was made to sound reliable. It moved easily between the face it showed and the nature it hid, practiced enough to do so without hesitation. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. The danger of the false prophet was not theological error presented plainly. It was error, or worse, spiritual predation, offered in the most convincing possible likeness of genuine faith. The sheep's clothing was not a hurried disguise. It was a careful performance, the language of true devotion, the warmth of pastoral care, the quiet confidence of spiritual authority, the presence of someone who seemed to move among the community of faith with the ease of one who belonged. A wolf wearing sheep's clothing had invested in that appearance because the appearance itself was the means of approach. The clothing was the strategy. Without it, the wolf could not draw near the sheep. In the first-century world, false prophets were rarely those who denied the faith in open words. Open denial needed no warning. It declared itself and could be seen from far away. The false prophet Jesus warned against was the one who lived inside the community, who used its language and its structures and its trust, who took a place as a guide and a voice of authority, and then turned that place toward purposes that had nothing to do with the true good of the people they influenced. The danger was real and had already been lived. The prophetic history of Israel carried a long and costly record of false prophets, voices that offered reassurance when the people needed warning, that confirmed the comfortable beliefs listeners preferred rather than the harder truths they needed, that kept their place among the people by speaking what the people most wanted to hear. Jeremiah and Ezekiel had both stood against such voices, whose sheep's clothing was skilled enough to persuade many for a long time. Jesus was telling those who followed him that this danger had not ended when the old prophetic age closed. It would continue wherever his name was taken as the mark of spiritual authority, and it would continue in the same form, convincing outwardly, dangerous within, known only by the test that outward appearance could never meet. Jesus repeated this twice in 4 verses, a repetition that was not accidental and was not empty emphasis. It was the careful insistence of a teacher who knew that the very point he was making was the one the sheep's clothing was designed to keep people from applying. The false prophet's whole approach depended on the listeners judging the clothing rather than the fruit. The repeated words pressed the right test forward, no matter how convincing the clothing appeared. The fruit Jesus described was not a single sudden disclosure. It was the observable, steady, character-revealing pattern of a life actually ordered around what it claimed to be ordered around. The image he chose, trees and their fruit, carried the meaning of the test itself: patience, careful watching over time, and the willingness to measure what was produced rather than what was claimed. A tree does not show its fruit at once. You watch it through the season. You wait for the time of bearing, and then look at what that time brings forth. Yet the tree cannot deceive the one who watches patiently. Whatever lives at the root will finally show itself in the fruit, no matter how strong the trunk looks or how green the leaves remain through the growing days. A bad tree cannot bear good fruit. The fruit Jesus pointed toward was the true character of a life when the performance was not underway, the way people were treated when no audience was present, the use of influence when no accountability stood nearby, the disposition of the heart when spiritual language was not being offered for any outward purpose, the humility that is real rather than displayed, the care for the vulnerable that continues when no one is watching and no recognition is given, the obedience to the Father that is present in the hidden places as fully as in the visible ones. This fruit could not be known in a single meeting. It asked for the steady attention of a community watching what could be seen across time, and it asked for the willingness to apply the test even when the clothing was impressive enough to make the examination feel unnecessary. The most searching element of Jesus' warning arrived in the final verses of the passage, the words that pressed the examination beyond false teachers and into the condition of every listener's own heart. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. The people Jesus described were not outsiders who had turned away from the faith. They were those who had moved inside the community of people who used his name, who had prophesied in his name, driven out demons in his name, performed miracles in his name. Their record of spiritual activity was remarkable by any measure available at the time. The works they named were the very ones the community of Jesus' followers connected with genuine power and divine authorization. "I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." The word "knew" here did not mean intellectual awareness. It meant the relational knowing of true connection, the knowing that grows between those who have walked in real relationship, who have shared the trust and openness and steady presence that relationship requires. Jesus was saying that behind the striking activities, behind the prophecies and the deliverances and the miracles, the actual relationship was missing. The name had been spoken. The power had been drawn upon. The works had been done. And in the place where genuine knowledge of one another should have lived, there was nothing. This is the disclosure that makes the passage most searching for those who hear it, because it means that impressive spiritual activity is not the proof of genuine relationship with God that it first appears to be. Miracles are not the final measure. Prophetic accuracy is not the final measure. The ability to act in spiritual power in the name of Jesus is not the final measure. These things can apparently take place even when the true, mutual, relationally rooted knowledge that Jesus named as the only criterion that mattered at the last accounting is absent. The final test was the one the fruit test had been pointing toward from the beginning. The will of the Father, carried out in the ordinary, quiet, unseen places of a daily life, truly ordered around obedience rather than display. Not the miraculous moments that offered evidence before an audience. The hidden, steady, character-shaping faithfulness of someone whose relationship with God was real in the places where no one watched and no recognition was given. The warning of Matthew 7:15-23 was not primarily negative. It was, like the preacher's reality check in Ecclesiastes, an act of care clothed in severity, a teacher refusing to leave his students open to a danger he could see and they might not, pressing past their natural hesitation so they would examine what the sheep's clothing was designed to keep them from seeing. He was guarding the community from the harm of spiritual predation, the real damage that false prophets had already caused and would continue to cause among those who trusted authority that was not trustworthy, who received guidance from sources whose true purpose was never what the outward presentation suggested. And he was guarding individual hearts from the danger of self-deception. The striking human capacity to build a life of impressive religious activity around a relationship with God that is not as real as the activity makes it appear, to speak the name of Jesus while performing significant spiritual works, even as the true, mutual, relationally rooted knowing that Jesus named as the measure of entrance remains undeveloped and uncultivated. The warning was a gift. The test it offered, fruit rather than clothing, the will of the Father rather than striking claims, was the gift held inside the warning. A clear, patient, available measure that the sheep's clothing could not satisfy and that a genuine life could not fail. By their fruit you will recognize them. The fruit will tell the truth that the clothing was meant to hide. To understand the full weight of Jesus' warning in Matthew 7:15-23, you need to understand what a prophet meant in the world he was speaking into, and how significant the authority that the prophetic role carried was in the communities that received it. In the tradition of Israel, the prophet was not simply a person with interesting spiritual opinions. The prophet was the one through whom God spoke, the messenger whose words carried divine authority, whose direction was to be received with the seriousness reserved for communication from the highest possible source. The Torah itself had established the office as central to Israel's relationship with God. and the centuries of Israel's history had been profoundly shaped by the voices of the great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12, whose words had warned, comforted, rebuked, and directed the people through the defining episodes of their national story. This authority was real and was treated as real. And where genuine authority creates genuine trust, the opportunity for false authority to exploit that trust is always present. The Hebrew Scriptures themselves had consistently warned against false prophets, people who claimed to speak for God while serving their own interests or the interests of the powers that supported them, who offered the community comfort and reassurance when the community needed warning and correction, who maintained their access and their influence by telling people what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to receive. Deuteronomy 18 had provided Israel with a test for the false prophet. If what they prophesied did not come to pass, they were not speaking from God. But Jesus was offering something more immediately applicable and more personally searching than a criterion that required waiting for the fulfillment of a prediction. He was offering a test that could be applied in real time through sustained observation without waiting for the prophetic claim to prove or disprove itself. The fruit of the life could be observed now, the character, the conduct, the actual submission to God's will in the ordinary daily choices that no audience was assembled to evaluate. The false prophets Jesus was warning against in first-century Judea and Galilee were not primarily people who announced their alternative agenda. They were people who operated within the structures of the Jewish religious community, who used the vocabulary of covenant faithfulness, who positioned themselves within the tradition rather than against it, who leveraged the community's genuine trust in prophetic authority to establish their own influence. The danger of the sheep's clothing was its functionality. It was not a hurried disguise adopted under pressure. It was a careful, sustained presentation that had been shaped precisely because the presentation itself was the means of approach. The false prophet who looked and sounded like a genuine prophet could move within the community's trust for a long time, as long as the community kept evaluating the clothing rather than the fruit. Jesus was interrupting this usual way of judging. He was not telling his followers that every prophet and teacher was dangerous. He was telling them that the test they were using to tell the genuine from the false was the wrong test. The appearance test. Does this person look and sound like someone who belongs among the people of faith? Was exactly the measure the sheep's clothing was made to meet. Applying it revealed nothing useful about what was truly present beneath the surface. The early Christian communities that received and passed on this warning found its practical use immediate and necessary. The letters of Paul, Peter, John, and Jude are largely concerned with the same problem Jesus was addressing: false teachers and false prophets working inside the community of faith, using the authority structures and the language of genuine faith to serve ends that were not consistent with genuine faith. The warning of Matthew 7:15-23 was not a distant theoretical caution. It was the foundation for a practice of discernment that the early church needed within its first generation. The fruit test that Jesus provided twice in 4 verses was carefully chosen to address the vulnerability that the sheep's clothing exploited. Fruit cannot be faked across time. A tree produces what it is, not what it claims to be, not what it appears to be from the road, but what the root system and the essential nature of the tree actually generate when the season of bearing arrives. The good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and the bad tree cannot produce good fruit, because the fruit is the expression of the nature rather than the performance of the appearance. In the Jewish wisdom tradition, the tree and fruit imagery carried a well-established theological resonance. The righteous person was repeatedly compared in the Psalms and the prophets to a tree planted by streams of water that produces its fruit in season. The fruitless tree was consistently the image of the person whose relationship with God was appearance without substance. Jesus was drawing on this tradition and applying it to the problem of prophetic discernment. The fruit that revealed the true prophet from the false was not the accuracy of any single prophecy, but the observable quality of the life from which the prophecy arose. Fruit in this context meant character expressed in conduct, the treatment of people when no audience was assembled, the exercise of power when no accountability was present, the consistency between the public presentation and the private reality, the submission to God's will in the ordinary, unglamorous choices of daily life, the humility that was present in the hidden places as well as the visible ones, the care for the vulnerable that continued when no credit was available, the integrity that held in the conversations that no one would report. This fruit could not be produced by talent or manufactured by effort. It was the overflow of genuine relationship with God, the natural expression of a life actually formed by what it claimed to be organized around. The most theologically significant element of the passage was the final verses, the declaration about those who would come to Jesus at the final accounting with the evidence of significant miraculous ministry, and here I never knew you. This was a theological revolution in the understanding of what constituted genuine relationship with God. The assumption that spiritual power was the proof of genuine spiritual standing, that the ability to prophesy, to drive out demons, to perform miracles in the name of Jesus was evidence of a genuine relationship with the one in whose name those things were done, was an assumption that Jesus directly dismantled. The works were real, the name had been invoked, the activities had been performed, and behind them, in the place where the relational knowledge that Jesus described should have been, was the absence that three words captured completely: I never knew you. The theological implication was comprehensive and searching. Miraculous activity in the name of Jesus was not the proof of genuine relationship with Jesus. The gifts were separable from the relationship. The power was apparently accessible without the knowing. And the final criterion was not the spectacular evidence of spiritual activity, but the simple, unglamorous, daily obedience to the will of the Father that the fruit test had been designed to evaluate all along. This teaching protected the early church from two theological errors that its history suggests it needed protection from. The first was the equation of spiritual gifts with spiritual maturity, the assumption that the person who operated in the most impressive spiritual power was therefore the most genuinely formed in genuine relationship with God. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians addressed this error directly, insisting that the gifts without love produce nothing of lasting value, and that the greatest charismata did not constitute the person who possessed them into the image of Christ. The second was the equation of religious profession with genuine faith, the assumption that the confident and eloquent invocation of Jesus' name was the evidence of the relationship the name was being invoked in. James addressed this from a different angle, but toward the same point. Faith without works was dead, and the works that evidenced genuine faith were not the spectacular works of miraculous ministry, but the ordinary, costly, daily obedience that genuine relationship with God consistently produced in the person it was genuine in. The fruit of the genuine life and the will of the Father done in the hidden places. This was the criterion that the sheep's clothing could not satisfy, and the miraculous claim could not substitute for. The false prophet's strategy succeeds not because people are foolish, but because the human mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do when it is drawn in by it. Social psychologists have extensively documented the phenomenon known as the halo effect, the tendency of the human brain to attribute positive qualities across the board to people who present well in a small number of highly visible dimensions. A person who is articulate, warm, theologically fluent, and spiritually impressive in their public presentation triggers an automatic extension of positive attribution into every other dimension of their character. If they speak well and move confidently within the community's trusted frameworks, the mind tends to assume their private life, their exercise of power, and their actual motives are equally trustworthy, without examining those dimensions separately. The sheep's clothing exploits this mechanism with quiet precision. The false prophet does not need to be genuinely trustworthy in every dimension. They need only to be convincingly impressive in the visible ones, the ones that trigger the halo effect's automatic extension of trust into the invisible. Once the halo is in place, the community's ordinary discernment mechanisms begin working against them rather than for them. Evidence of concerning private conduct is explained away rather than examined. Warning signals are rationalized as misunderstandings. The impressive public presence becomes a lens through which everything inconsistent with the established impression is filtered into a form that preserves the impression rather than challenges it. Jesus was interrupting this mechanism with a deliberate counter-training. Do not look at the clothing. Look at the fruit. This was not simply a theological instruction. It was a psychological discipline, the trained habit of redirecting attention from the dimension that the false prophet's strategy was designed to control toward the dimension that the strategy could not control indefinitely. The fruit test requires something that the halo effect consistently undermines: patience. The willingness to wait for the bearing season rather than making the judgment in the growing season when the tree's leaves are convincingly green. Psychological research on trust formation consistently demonstrates that human beings are not well designed by default for the kind of sustained, patient observation that genuine discernment requires. We are designed for rapid evaluation, the quick assessment of threat or safety that was adaptive in the environments where human judgment evolved. This rapid evaluation worked reasonably well for detecting the obvious wolf. It is especially vulnerable to the wolf who has learned to manage the initial impression carefully. The fruit test Jesus prescribed was a counter to this rapid evaluation default. He was training his followers to delay their trust formation, to keep the question open longer than felt comfortable, to maintain the evaluative posture past the point where the impressive presentation had generated the momentum toward premature closure. By their fruit, you will recognize them implied that the recognition required the fruit's appearance and the fruit's appearance required the passage of time and the arrival of the bearing season. The people who practiced this patience described a consistent experience. The discomfort of the sustained evaluation gave way over time to a clarity that the rapid evaluation never produced. The things that were present in the hidden places of a person's life, the treatment of those with less power, the consistency between public message and private conduct, the character that expressed itself in the ordinary, unglamorous choices that no audience evaluated, became legible through sustained observation in a way that they were completely invisible to the initial impression. The most psychologically significant dimension of Matthew 7:15-23 was the way Jesus extended the fruit test from the evaluation of others to the examination of the self. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven. The passage that began as a warning about false prophets in the community ended as an examination of the individual heart. The same question that the fruit test raised about the teacher, is the impressive presentation backed by genuine substance, was turned inward and applied to every listener's own relationship with God. This internal application was psychologically clear and distinctly uncomfortable. The false prophet is easy to condemn in the abstract, the obvious other whose predatory behavior toward the community justifies righteous indignation. The warning becomes considerably more searching when it turns the same evaluative framework on the person who was just congratulating themselves on their discernment about false prophets. Are you invoking the name? Are you performing the activities? And in the place where the genuine knowing should be, the actual, mutual, relationally grounded knowledge of a person in genuine relationship with God, what is actually present? The self-deception that produces the shocking scene of verse 22, people confidently presenting their miraculous resume to Jesus and receiving "I never knew you," was not produced by obvious hypocrisy. It was produced by the gradual substitution of impressive religious activity for the genuine relationship that the activity was supposed to represent. This substitution is psychologically seamless because the activities feel spiritual, produce real results, generate real community recognition, and provide real feedback that confirms the person in the belief that the relationship is as genuine as the activity suggests. The fruit test, applied internally, interrupts this substitution with the same question it applies to the false prophet. Not what activities are being performed, but what is the actual character of the life in the places where the activity cannot justify itself. The will of the Father done in the hidden places. The genuine knowing that exists between people who have been in real relationship with each other. The communities and individuals who took the fruit test seriously and applied it with the patience it required described consistent outcomes, a form of protection from the harm that impressive presentations concealed, and a growing clarity about what genuine faith actually looked like when the clothing was not the basis of the evaluation. They also described a deepening of their own faith, because the regular practice of asking what fruit is this life producing applied inward as well as outward, and the inward application consistently pointed toward the same criterion that Jesus had named as the final one, the will of the Father, done in the ordinary, unglamorous daily obedience that no audience was assembled to evaluate. The discerning heart became the formed heart, shaped by the same test it was applying to the world around it, continuously pointed toward the genuine relationship with God that both the false prophet's clothing and the self-deceived believer's impressive activity were attempting to substitute for. By their fruit you will recognize them, and by the same fruit, the honest, patient, hidden place fruit of a life genuinely submitted to the Father's will, you will recognize whether what you have is what you think you have. The harm that Matthew 7:15-23 was warning against was not theoretical damage to abstract theological categories. It was the personal, sometimes irreversible damage done to real people who placed genuine trust in a presentation that was not what it appeared to be. The person who sits under the influence of a false prophet is not being harmed by obvious error. They are being harmed by convincing truth-adjacent error, teaching that contains enough genuine content to be credible, delivered by someone whose presentation is compelling enough to generate the kind of trust that makes critical evaluation feel unnecessary or even disloyal. The sheep's clothing is effective precisely because it does not look dangerous. The community that should be asking the fruit questions is instead receiving the impressive presentation and extending the trust that impressive presentations generate. The damage that accumulates inside this trust is the damage of a life being shaped by the wrong voice. Obedience is not a neutral activity. It forms the person who practices it, building the character and the values and the patterns of response that become, over time, the person's actual orientation toward God and toward other people. A person who has been practicing obedience to a false teacher for months or years has been formed by the obedience in ways that the discovery of the deception does not immediately undo. The formation happened. The reshaping of it requires time and genuine pastoral care that the false prophet never provided and the damage never budgeted for. The confusion that follows the discovery of a false prophet's true character is one of the most disorienting spiritual experiences available to a genuine believer, because it does not only raise questions about the teacher, it raises questions about everything the teacher taught, everything the community that formed around the teacher built, and everything the person who followed the teacher believed they were doing in following them. Were the miracles real? If they were, does that mean the teaching was also trustworthy? Jesus had already answered this. No. Miraculous activity was not proof of genuine relationship with God or genuine transmission of God's truth. But for the person whose trust in the teacher was substantially supported by the miraculous evidence, disentangling the reality of the activity from the trustworthiness of the person performing it was not a simple task. The misplaced trust had a practical dimension as well. Communities that had organized their shared life around a false prophet's teaching and authority had to navigate the aftermath of the collapse. The relationships fractured by the revelation, the theological framework that needed to be rebuilt, the pastoral care needs of people who had been genuinely harmed and who now needed genuine help from sources they were not yet certain they could trust. The deepest harm was the damage done to the capacity for genuine faith in the people who had been deceived. Not the destruction of faith. Genuinely formed faith is considerably more resilient than the false prophet's deception anticipated. But the damage of a person whose trust has been exploited by something that presented itself as trustworthy in the name of God. The wariness that follows a serious experience of deception by a spiritual leader is not simply the rational update of a person who has learned to evaluate more carefully. It is the injury of someone whose openness was exploited at the level of their deepest spiritual commitments, and whose capacity to extend that openness again requires more than correct theology to restore. Jesus warned against the false prophet before the damage occurred, because the warning was the only intervention that came before the cost. The fruit test was not a clever theological principle. It was the protection that the warning was offering, the applicable, patient, character-revealing test that the sheep's clothing was designed to prevent but could not ultimately survive. Apply it before the trust is extended. The transformation that Matthew 7:15-23 produces in those who take it seriously begins not with a dramatic spiritual experience, but with a quiet, courageous act of examination, the willingness to apply the fruit test to the voices that have been shaping their faith, regardless of how impressive the clothing has been or how uncomfortable the examination feels. This is not a comfortable transformation. The person who has been sitting under the influence of a compelling teacher, receiving their words with the trust that impressive presentations generate, discovering community and meaning within the framework that teaching has provided. This person does not apply the fruit test without cost. The examination threatens not only their assessment of the teacher, but the entire structure of the faith community and the theological understanding they have built inside the teacher's influence. The stakes of the examination are high precisely because the investment in the presentation has been deep, and this is exactly why Jesus gave the warning before the damage fully accumulated, because the examination, costly as it is, costs less than the continued formation by a voice whose fruit the examination would have revealed as bad. The person who applied the fruit test and found it wanting, who looked past the eloquence and the miracles and the warmth of the presentation toward the actual character of the life beneath it, and found a gap between what was presented and what was actually there, faced the grief of a disillusionment that touched their deepest spiritual commitments. But they also found, on the other side of that grief, something more valuable than the comfortable deception it replaced, the clarity of a person who now knew what the test was and was capable of applying it. The narratives of people who recognized the sheep's clothing, applied the fruit test, turned from the false teacher, and found their way to voices whose lives matched their words, consistently describe the same experience on the other side of the transition. They describe relief, not the immediate, uncomplicated relief of a simple correction, but the deeper, slower relief of someone who has been carrying the weight of a nagging inconsistency they could not quite name and has finally named it and acted on it. The fruit test gave them language for what they had been sensing without being able to articulate. The gap between the impressive presentation and the actual life, the distance between the public message and the private conduct, the absence of the genuine formation that genuine faith was supposed to be producing. And they describe a different quality of faith on the other side of the examination, less dazzled by the spectacular, more attentive to the ordinary, more capable of the sustained observation that fruit requires. The person who has once been deceived by the sheep's clothing and has learned to apply the fruit test carries a discernment that the deception inadvertently produced in them, the hard-won capacity to look past the impressive presentation and ask the patient, inconvenient, necessary question about what the bearing season will reveal. The full transformation that the passage was designed to produce was not only the protection from false prophets, it was the formation of people whose own lives were organized around the criterion that the fruit test applied to others. The person who consistently asked, "What is this life actually producing in the hidden places?" about the voices they were following, inevitably began asking the same question about their own life. The test that revealed the false prophet also revealed the condition of the person applying it, because the will of the Father done in the unglamorous daily places was not only the criterion for the genuine prophet, but for every person who wanted to avoid the devastating 3 words at the final accounting. "I never knew you" was the warning that the fruit test applied inward was designed to prevent. The transformed community was one that looked for character rather than clothing, obedience rather than eloquence, the hidden consistency of a life genuinely submitted to the Father's will, rather than the spectacular evidence of impressive spiritual activity. Their discernment protected them from the wolf. Their obedience protected them from the self-deception that the wolf's warning had always been pointing toward as the deeper danger. The fruit test, taken seriously, changed everything. It still does. The most immediate practical response to Matthew 7:15-23 is the replacement of one question with another, the substitution of the question that the sheep's clothing was designed to answer with the question that only the fruit test can answer. The wrong question: does this person present convincingly within the framework of genuine faith? This question evaluates the clothing. The false prophet's entire strategy is designed to satisfy it, and satisfying it produces no useful information about what is actually present beneath the presentation. The right question: what is this person's life actually producing in the places where no audience is assembled to evaluate it? This question evaluates the fruit. It requires patience, sustained observation, and the willingness to look past the impressive presentation toward the character that the bearing season will eventually reveal. Ask the right question about every voice that is shaping your faith, not once, not in the initial encounter when the clothing is most convincing, but consistently, over time, with the patient attention that genuine fruit evaluation requires. The bearing season takes the time it takes. The examination cannot be completed in a single impressive encounter, regardless of how compelling the encounter was. The fruit test Jesus provided was not vague. "By their fruit you will recognize them" was a clear instruction about observable evidence. Apply it carefully. Examine the character that the teacher's life expresses in the dimensions that the public presentation does not control. How do they treat people with less power than themselves, the ones whose response to poor treatment would not damage the public reputation? How do they exercise authority when accountability is not visibly present? Is the humility they preach present in the private interactions that no audience evaluates? Does the lifestyle they inhabit match the message they are delivering? These questions are not cynical. They are the careful application of the test that Jesus said would distinguish the genuine from the false, and they protect both the person asking and the community they are part of from the damage that impressive presentations concealing dangerous character consistently produce. Do not accept miraculous activity or eloquent words as the final answer to these questions. Jesus said explicitly that neither constituted proof of genuine relationship with God or genuine faithfulness in transmission of God's truth. The miraculous claim is not the evidence that makes the fruit examination unnecessary. It is the evidence that makes the fruit examination more important. Because the impressive presentation is now larger, the halo effect is now stronger, and the default suspension of the fruit test is now more tempting. The fruit test was not designed to be applied in isolation. Jesus gave the warning to a community, to followers who would live in relationship with each other, who would encounter teachers together, and who could provide each other the sustained observation that individual encounters could not supply. Share the test with the people around you. When an impressive teacher arrives or an influential voice begins to shape the community's direction, establish the shared practice of asking the fruit question together, not as collective suspicion, but as the communal discernment that the community's spiritual health requires. The community that applies the fruit test together is considerably harder to deceive than the community of isolated individuals, each making their own initial impression assessments. The sheep's clothing that convinces one person can be identified by the sustained, communal, patient observation of the many. Return to this warning whenever impressive appearances begin to outweigh consistent fruit in your evaluation of the voices shaping your faith. The clothing can be very convincing. The fruit will tell the truth, and the truth, received in time, costs considerably less than the damage that the comfortable deception was always building toward. On the mountainside that day, the crowds heard the warning about false prophets who come in sheep's clothing and the clear test of fruit. Some went away still impressed by powerful words and signs. Others began to look more carefully at the lives behind the claims. Families sat together in the evening light and repeated the teaching. By their fruit you will recognize them. A man who had followed an impressive teacher examined the daily character and turned away. A woman who once valued miracles above obedience learned to test what she heard against the will of the Father. Across the years, the same warning has protected others standing among competing voices. Sheep's clothing still appears gentle and familiar. Fruit still reveals the truth of a life. Miracles and eloquent claims still prove nothing by themselves. A young believer later refused a popular teacher whose private conduct contradicted his public message. A household chose leaders whose lives matched their words and found steady guidance. The test remained simple and sure. You rest now with the clear protection Jesus gave. Watch carefully for the outward appearance that hides danger. Examine the fruit of character, lifestyle, and obedience. Stay with those who do the will of the Father. Sleep comes gently, carrying the quiet assurance that the warning is given so that the flock may remain safe. The story continues, steady and true. Rest well.